Good Governance Africa's 2021 Governance Performance Index reveals that South African municipalities across the 9 provinces struggle with 2 essential aspects of governance: administration and service delivery provision. These failings have direct impact on economic growth, pose a risk to political stability, and have significant implications for the business and investor community. I am Busisipo Siobi, lead researcher at GGA, and to help us unpack the matter is my colleague Pranish, Desai, data analyst in the Governance Insights and Analytics program here at GGA. Pranish, the Governance Insights and Analytics program recently published an intelligence report looking at the role of governance in creating political stability, but mainly with a joint focus on private-public partnerships. Before we dive into that, can you walk us through some of the contextual background and the state of local government?
Thanks, Pussy. So like you said, local government and municipalities in particular have issues with 2 critical aspects of governance and their constitutional mandate, namely clean financial administration and the provision of basic services, things like water, electricity, adequate sanitation. What we find is that municipalities do quite well in terms of planning and monitoring. Generally, they score better in that category of the GPI, which looks at 3 categories of governance, but they do less well on the 2 more important, arguably, categories of governance, which are administration and service delivery provision. This has resulted in a situation where trust in local government is very low. In fact, according to a recent survey, only 1 in 4 South Africans actually trust their local government councils.
Walk us through the development of the GPI, which actually assesses the performance of municipalities. How was it developed?
So the GPI Governance Performance Index scores local municipalities and the 205 of these in South Africa according to 3 aspects of their constitutional mandate: administration, service delivery, and planning and monitoring. Service delivery is weighted the most given its importance in the role of local councils in South Africa.
Now, what are the requirements for creating democratic accountability, political stability, and what are some of the findings from the intelligence report that you can just walk us through?
So our most recent intelligence report revealed that there's a clear linkage between better performances at the local municipal level, higher levels of democratic accountability, especially in terms of voter turnout. That's especially important given that voter turnout in South Africa as a whole is in decline at this point in time. We also find that better municipal performance is strongly linked with better development outcomes, including lower levels of poverty, high levels of employment, and high levels of formal housing. And then perhaps most relevant, given the aftermath of last year's social upheaval in July 2021, which was marked by riots, especially in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng provinces, we find that weaker municipalities in these areas, riots far outnumber, more democratic forms of protests like service delivery protests, which are a perfect fit for a democratic society, but riots are a clear violation of the law in many respects.
Now, when it comes to businesses and the investor community, why is it important for them to consider in ensuring that they create the political stability for democratic accountability, for just better development? Why does it matter for those communities?
There's a self-interest component to this for businesses. Ultimately, if there's things like riots or social disruption, South Africa as a whole becomes less attractive to investors itself. Last year's riots, as a direct result of those riots, according to an expert panel report commissioned by the South African presidency, nearly 50 billion rand was lost to the overall economy over just 2 weeks. And this works on a basic day-to-day level as well. Hundreds of businesses had to shutter permanently as a result of this disruption. So businesses and investors have a clear stake in ensuring that there's stable and effective governance at the local level in South Africa.
Intelligence report, you actually examined the Greater Kokstad municipality. What are some of the observations with that particular municipality, and why do you think it actually performed better than others?
So Greater Kokstad is a very interesting case study because it's located in KwaZulu-Natal, where generally municipalities perform less well. In fact, on average, municipalities there perform the second worst out of any province. But Greater Kokstad was both the 9th highest ranking South African municipality and also the highest ranking municipality in KwaZulu-Natal. Interestingly as well, given that KwaZulu-Natal was the epicenter of the disruptions last year, Greater Kokstad experienced no riots or even indeed protests for an entire 4-year period between 2017 and 2021. Strong and decisive local leadership, which prioritizes the delivery of basic services, is one critical component which differentiates Greater Kokstad from its peers inside KwaZulu-Natal and indeed the country as a whole.
You mentioned that there are still some problems with existing frameworks. Can you speak to more of this, please?
In Greater Kokstad's annual integrated development plans, they often lament the fact that having public-private partnerships in South Africa is a very arduous task. There are many barriers to entry, including a long, slow process. Many municipalities lack the technical, legal, and financial expertise to actually implement PPPs. But moreover, there's just also a general lack of willingness from national government and sometimes businesses to actually engage with municipalities on this. This is somewhere where other African countries are actually showing the way. For instance, there's a recent example in Zambia and in a mining town called Kalumbila. And there they have strong public-private partnerships which have resulted in a very new developed town. The town's only emerged in the last 10 years, but it's increasingly attracting young people in search for jobs, economic opportunities, and investors as a result are also seeing the benefits of having such strong partnerships between local government and the private sector.
And then the question of accountability, Pranish, comes in. I think a lot of private companies can argue that they're already paying their taxes. They already have social corporate responsibility initiatives in place. So who would be responsible for what in this particular regard?
The question of accountability is always important, especially in a democratic society and in a society like South Africa where a lot was sacrificed to realize such a democratic society. What that means in the case of local municipalities and PPPs is that, yes, local municipalities should be the final part of government that is actually responsible for its basic roles and responsibilities, such as clean financial administration and the provision of basic services. However, to ensure that they're best placed to deliver on that mandate, government and the private sector can play a role in ensuring that they have the necessary capacity to actually realize those goals. And for now, there are indeed actual impediments in terms of how the legislative process for this is slow. But one way in which business can play a role and the private sector can play a role is by putting pressure on government to find a way to revise the current legislation to make sure that PPPs are actually something that can be enacted with more rapidness in future.
What are the recommendations from the intelligence report in this regard?
So in addition to the recommendation that the private sector and government should review the current process for enacting PPPs, there are another two recommendations that I'd specifically like to highlight. The first is that the private sector has to generally have its own best practices to ensure things like financial sustainability and clean governance in that respect for themselves. That means that the skills exist for themselves. One thing they can do is sponsor training workshops for workers in municipal offices who are responsible for things like clean financial administration. And they then have sharing of skills, something which would benefit both the local community and also potentially the private sector. Another is in terms of economic opportunities for young people and the provision of them. We all know that South Africa has a massive problem in terms of youth unemployment. Municipalities don't really have the budgets to actually personally provide internships and those sorts of opportunities for young people, but businesses generally do have that capacity, and also they'd like to have people help them out and in terms of employment opportunities. So what businesses can do is actually create those opportunities and target them towards people in their local communities, while municipalities utilize their own communication departments to get access to the actual young people there to encourage them to participate in this process.
Thank you very much for sharing those insights. For democratic accountability, development, and political stability to be realized, it is prudent for private sector interests to become long-term development partners of municipalities, improving capacity in administration and service delivery. For more in-depth discussions on policy matters in Africa, please join us again. Don't forget to